My first exposure to the elite was back in 1972 when I read a book titled None Dare Call It Conspiracy by Gary Allen. Gary sold over $6 million of this small book, and this book stayed in the back of my mind for quite a number of years. I couldn't get it out of my mind until in 1992 I was doing research for a book that will later be titled What's Wrong in the United States and How to Fix It. This book will be about government corruption and our industrial and business world corruption. And as I was doing research for this book, I kept running into these secret societies. I decided that was a much more important subject, so I set that book aside and did an intense study of the elite. And in 1995, I published my first book titled Who's Who of the Elite, which was later revised in the year 2000. And it contains all the members of the three secret organizations, the Bilderbergs, the Council of Foreign Relations, Trilateral Commission. This plot to control the entire world politically and economically was first revealed in my first book titled Who's Who of the Elite, members of the Bilderberg, Council on Foreign Relations, and Trilateral Commission. The first research for this book first began in 1992 and ended in the publication of the first issue in 1995. It was revised later in the year 2000. There's a goal of the elite, which is to create a one-world government. The term used when President George Herbert Walker Bush was in office was New World Order. That has since been changed to globalization, because when George Bush used that term, the public's eyes opened up and their ears opened up, and so they became more alert about what he was talking about. And so the elite decided that they needed to pick a more mundane term, so they switched to the term globalization or global. And whenever they talk about global economy, global environment, global architecture, global village, or any terms like this that contain the word global or globalization, those terms exactly equal the old term, the New World Order. Now, the global union is made up essentially of four regions. The first region is called the European Union. So let's get into the evolution of the European Union. The first discussions of the creation of the European Union began as far back as the 1954 Bilderberg Conference in Oosterbeek, the Netherlands, their first conference. And David Rockefeller attended that conference, was one of the main speakers on this subject. Then in 1958, the Western European leaders created what they then called the European Economic Community, or the EEC. Then on May the 3rd, 1960, these Western Europeans created or changed the name to the European Free Trade Association, or the EFTA. The next step in this transition was in 1967, when they changed the name to the European Community, or the EC. The next transition was in 1972, when they renamed the group and called it the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, or the OECD. Then on November 1st, 1993, they changed the name to the European Union, which is now widely used, and it was made up of 12 nations of Western Europe. Then on January the 1st, 1995, Austria, Finland, and Sweden were invited to join the European Union. The European Union is still in transition, but was officially completed in the year 2000. The European Union has one monetary system, with the exception of Denmark, United Kingdom, and Sweden, the only three holdouts at this time. There is only one central bank, which is located in Frankfurt. By the way, this is where the central banking system first got its start, when the first person to be called Rothschild set up a central bank in Frankfurt. They also have one judicial system and one military force. Eventually, this military force will replace the present NATO force. There's still dispute between the United States and Europe about this transition, but it will eventually take place. The EU has only one governing body called the European Parliament, and now they do not require visas when citizens of the EU pass from one nation to the other. The new constitution for the European Union is still being written, and it's been presented in rough draft form a couple of times, but has not been ratified by all the 15 nations of the European Union yet. But it will then replace any constitution in effect in any of those 15 nations. The global union is broken down into 10 regions, as is the United Nations. There are 10 regions within the United Nations. There are 10 regions within the European Union, and FEMA is set up in 10 regions within the United States, which is consistent with their overall plan. The second region to be formed under the global union is called the African Union. So let's get into the evolution of the African Union. Now let's talk about the creation of the next phase of the global union, which is now called the African Union, but it started on May the 25th, 1963, and was then called the Organization of African Unity, or OAU. Then on July the 11th, the year 2000, finally, all the nations, 53 nations of Africa, primarily sub-Saharan Africa, created what they called the African Union, or the AU, and it's made up of one governing body. They have one peacekeeping force, one central bank, one court of justice, and one currency. The third region to be brought under the global union is one that they will later call the American Union. And so let's get into the evolution of the soon-to-be American Union. Now, as we get into the creation of the American Union, which will be a carbon copy of the European Union, it started back in 1965 when David Rockefeller created the Council of the Americas, commonly called America Society. And it's made up of all the nations of North, Central, and South America and the Caribbean islands, with the exception of Cuba. They meet at least annually, and more often in recent years, as they move closer into the creation of the American Union. The next phase in the creation of the American Union happened in January 1994, when the NAFTA, or North American Free Trade Agreement, was implemented between Canada, the United States, and Mexico. This is the first official phase of the American Union. The elite have been conducting meetings on the expansion of the North American Free Trade Agreement, and the next phase will be what they call CAFTA, or the Central American Free Trade Area, and this is scheduled for completion probably by December 2003. The final establishment of the Free Trade Area of the Americas is scheduled for completion at least by December 31st, 2004. So then, after the Free Trade Area of the Americas is complete by December 31st, 2004, they will then change the name to the American Union, and this will be officially done somewhere in the year 2005 or 2006. Now, they won't create the American Union in the year 2004 because that's a major presidential election year, and they want Bush to be reelected. And so even though they will be working on the Free Trade Area Americas, they won't change the name to the American Union until after that election is over, sometime in 2005 and 2006. But it will then be a carbon copy of the European Union with one central bank, one governing body, one military force, one police force, one judicial system, one monetary system, all for North, Central, and South America and Caribbean islands, with the possible exception of Cuba. By then, something may happen to Castro, and they may include Cuba by then. The next region of the global union will be the Pacific Union. So let's get into the evolution of the Pacific Union. Now let's discuss the fourth phase of the creation of the global union. That will be the Asian Union. In November 1989, the Asian Pacific Economic Cooperation, or APEC, was founded and made up of all the nations of the Pacific Rim. They meet annually, and they are the fourth phase of the global union. Now, I've talked about the creation of the global union in my book, Who's Who of the Elite, which has been in print since 1985. And I just gave you a discussion of the evolution that will be leading toward the global union. And so for those that don't believe what I'm talking about, let's go to some video clips that were taken from C-SPAN's broadcast about some very powerful people, insiders in these elite organizations, as they talk about the creation of the global union and the American Union. So let's get right into the videos.
That is happening in New York City. In an age even of computer communication and international communication and the ability to communicate with the people by fax and in all kinds of different ways, it still is important to be somewhere, to be in a place, to see people, to deal with them, and to be face-to-face with them. And New York City gives you that opportunity. The Rockefeller family understood that and foresaw that New York was the inevitable home for the United Nations. the geographical center for the voice of humanity. In a brief video introduced by the United Nations Secretary General Boutros Boutros-Ghali and containing some exceptional footage, the connection between the United Nations, New York City, and the Rockefeller Foundation is clearly drawn. So if we could play the video, I really would appreciate your watching it. I think you're going to enjoy it very, very much.
On the eve of the 50th anniversary of the United Nations, it is important to recognize more than just an event. Arriving at the critical juncture in history, this anniversary holds immense potential for the peoples of the world. To appreciate, preserve, and strengthen the achievements of the United Nations, to examine new challenges which require creative action, and most importantly, to chart a course for the future. In doing this, it is appropriate to reflect and to draw strengths from the early history of the United Nations. The Rockefeller family embodied the idealism of those years.
John D. Rockefeller Jr.'s early backing of the League of Nations in the 1920s demonstrated the Rockefeller family's commitment to international peaceful cooperation. Grants promoting investigations into the narcotics trade and the traffic in women and children, and his endowment of a League of Nations library were evidence of his moral and financial support. While the League of Nations floundered and ultimately failed, its ideals lived on. As World War II was drawing to a close, a new world organization was conceived, the United Nations. This historic footage shows how the concept became reality.
The idea, initiated at the famous Yalta Conference in the closing days of World War II, was to be followed through to completion by the delegations of some 50 nations, including that of the United States, shown here at a preliminary meeting in Washington. April 25th, 1945, while the war was still raging overseas, the free nations of the world assembled for the first meeting of the historic conference from which was to evolve the final drafting of the Charter. The President spoke to the assemblage from a radio microphone in Washington, D.C.
The world has experienced a revival of an old faith in the everlasting moral force of justice. At no time in history has there been a more important conference or a more necessary meeting than this one in San Francisco. You members of this conference are to be the architects of a better world. In your hands rests our future. By your labors at this conference, we shall know if suffering humanity is to achieve a just and lasting peace. If we do not want to die together in war, we must learn to live together in peace.
On June 25th, 1945, the Charter was signed in a formal ceremony by each of the 50 nations present at the conference. Out of the chaos of World War II had come a global brotherhood that carried within its legislative structure the seeds of world peace for the generations to come.
Many tasks were set before the young United Nations, including the resettlement of World War II refugees, the drive to secure fundamental human rights, the struggle to limit the growing proliferation of atomic weapons, and the task of finding a permanent home for the organization. The world looked on as a search was initiated.
Arriving in New York to choose United Nations headquarters, delegates from 7 nations are welcomed by Grover Whalen. They must choose a site within the New York or Boston areas. The committee calls on President Truman at the White House before proceeding to inspect locations. The eastern United States will soon hold the new capital of the world.
Nelson Rockefeller, a former member of the U.S. delegation to San Francisco, was appointed by New York City Mayor O'Dwyer to interest the UN in building on the 1939 World's Fairgrounds in Flushing Meadow. When the UN rejected this proposal, the Rockefeller family considered offering part of their own estate, Pocantico, and adjoining properties for the headquarters site. No decision had been made when the UN convened in the fall of 1946. The Rockefeller family was more concerned than ever with bringing the UN to New York City. News accounts from the period convey the atmosphere.
As the weary delegates of 54 nations prepare to end their meeting, the world takes stock of recent weeks, highlighted by the beginnings of cooperation. Hopeful signs are the unanimously passed resolution on armaments reduction and atomic controls. And there was big news in the last days as headlines told another story: the gift of a site by John D. Rockefeller Jr. for a permanent world capital in New York. Quickly accepted, the strip along Manhattan's East River is valued at $8.5 million. An ideal site for skyscraper headquarters, the 6-block area extends from 42nd to 48th Street.
The Rockefeller family formally presented its gift to the UN in March of 1947.
The future of this country and the lives of our children and our children's children are interwoven with the success of the United Nations. In it lies the hope of the people of the world. My father considers it a privilege to have had a part in the development of its permanent home. I'm glad to hand you, Mr. Lee, my father's check.
Thank you, Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rockefeller, Mayor O'Dwyer, the United Nations extends its sincere thanks to you and to your father for this magnificent gift. We intend to go ahead and create on the East River site a dignified and appropriate headquarters for the United Nations, which will stand for generations to come as a great monument to peace and security. Your family can be proud of its contribution to this cause.
Thank you very much.
The Rockefeller gift changed the course of history and brought the United Nations to New York City. It is a gift which gave practical and moral support to the young United Nations, thus enabling it to succeed where the League of Nations had failed. It is a gift which furthered the United Nations mission to help save succeeding generations from the scourge of war.
And the Rockefeller family's commitments to the United Nations did not end with this exceptional gift. It continues to the present day, and it is personified by David Rockefeller, whom we honor for his dedication to democratic principle, for his dedication to development, and for his dedication to international peace.
The Medal of the Business Council for the United Nations is presented every year to an individual who has made a significant contribution to the United Nations and to world peace. Past recipients include Margaret Thatcher, Thomas Pickering, Javier Perez de Cuellar, Mikhail Gorbachev, Ronald Reagan, and George Bush. This evening, the prestige of this famous award is enhanced, again, as it's bestowed upon one of the formidable figures of the 20th century, a force for freedom and peace in the world, David Rockefeller. Please stand up here. You hold that. I'm going to list just a very, very few of David's contributions. He was the founder of the America Society, an organization that promotes inter-American cooperation. He helped found the Trilateral Commission, designed to promote understanding and cooperation among the nations of North America, Western Europe, and Japan. He was instrumental in creating the International Executive Service Corps, a group of volunteers from the private sector who provide technical and managerial assistance to private enterprise in developing nations. For 15 years, he served as the chairman of the Council on Foreign Relations. Among other international achievements, David Rockefeller is the honorary chairman of the Japan Society, an honorary trustee of the International House, and a member of the Advisory Council of the Bilderberg Conference. David, as the mayor of New York City, I want to thank you very, very much for bringing the United Nations to New York City. As a citizen of the United States, I want to thank you very much for all that you have done for America, you and your family. And as a citizen of the world, thank you for everything you've done for world peace.
Thank you. Mr. Mayor, ladies and gentlemen, I must say I'm quite overwhelmed by this wonderful reception, and I do wish to extend a great many thanks to the mayor and to all of you for this extraordinary offer of an award to me on behalf of my family this evening. I'd have to say that I would like in turn to add my voice to others who have already spoken about Mayor Giuliani for the outstanding leadership that I feel he's provided to this city, something that we greatly needed. In just a short time, as Dick Vole has said, he's reversed a downward trend in the city and has and I think he's given New Yorkers a sense of hope and confidence that we haven't had for a considerable amount of time. Mr. Mayor, we're very grateful to you for that. I think I'd also be remiss if I didn't take this occasion to express my thanks to my good friends Dick Vole and Bill Murray and Sam Brookfield, and to all of you in the Business Council for the United Nations for selecting me as the recipient of this year's well-respected honor and medal. All the more so because in pursuing the names of the 6 previous recipients of the Business Council's medal, I find the following: 1 Secretary General, 1 Ambassador, and 4 heads of state. Frankly, ladies and gentlemen, I wonder how a mere retired banker could have been allowed to join that distinguished company. But I quickly add that I hasten to accept the award before you change your minds. I've long been an admirer of the works of the Business Council and wholeheartedly endorse its role of encouraging the interest and backing of the business community in the vitally important mission of the United Nations. Now, as the United Nations approaches its 50th anniversary, business support for the numerous internationally related problems in which it is involved has never been more urgently needed. But before sharing with you a few thoughts on the need for strong leadership in the world of today, I think I should just take a moment to express how deeply touched I was by the wonderful film that we've just witnessed, which traced my family's involvement in the early days of the United Nations. My father, as the film suggests, was a man of peace who believed deeply in the ultimate benefits of peaceful cooperation and continuous dialogue among the peoples and nations of the world. Recalling his role and that of my brothers, John and Nelson, as you may have noted, makes this occasion very especially meaningful for me. Had they still been alive, and I wish they were, I would have supported your conferring on one or all of them this award this evening. The film touched me briefly, but it also touched briefly on the history of the United Nations. I'd like to begin my own remarks this evening with a brief reflection on the history of the United States as it sheds light on our own involvement with the United Nations today. The United States, as the saying goes, is a nation of immigrants. The Pilgrims and other early pioneers came here from Britain and Western Europe to escape religious persecution and to find a new life of opportunity and freedom. Subsequent waves of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe brought both ethnic diversity and exceptional levels of talent and dedication to hard work. The reprehensible slave trade of the 17th and 18th centuries brought Africans to these shores and created institutions and social divisions that took a civil war and more than a century of concentrated effort to overcome. Yet African Americans today have become an essential and positive strand in the fabric of our nation. Most recently, waves of Latinos and Asians have contributed new elements to our rich cultural and ethnic diversity. For more than 400 years, the strength of this nation has lain in our capacity to absorb and transform a complex and diverse population into a homogeneous nation, where a single primary language provides a common basis for communication and mutual understanding. As our nation grew in numbers and expanded across the continent, opportunities flourished for anyone with ability and ambition. Underpinning this process of national expansion was our Constitution, crafted at the moment of our national independence by a group of talented and far-sighted leaders whose principles were firmly rooted in the ideals of democracy and individual freedom. 2 world wars in the first half of this century forced the United States to emerge from its primary preoccupation with internal expansion and economic growth to become a power with global influence and responsibilities. That is the position in which we find ourselves today, as the most powerful nation on earth, near the peak of our worldwide influence and authority. Indeed, with the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the discrediting of centrally planned economies, the opportunity for enlightened American leadership is perhaps even greater than it was in 1939 at the beginning of the Second World War, or in 1945 when the Cold War began. But this persistent window and this present window of opportunity, during which a truly peaceful and interdependent world order might be built, will not be here for too long. Already there are powerful forces at work that threaten to destroy all of our hopes and efforts to erect an enduring structure of global cooperation. I refer here to those ruthless advocates of ethnic nationalism who seek to break apart existing nations, as well as to militant fundamentalists who want to subordinate or even eliminate anyone who refuses to comply with their own rigid ideological beliefs. In contrast to those radical and divisive forces, our contemporary world has also seen the emergence of an array of scientific, technological, and economic phenomena that are linking nations more closely together, making enhanced cooperation not only possible, but absolutely imperative. Breakthroughs and advances in many fields such as genetics, molecular biology, computers, and telecommunications have given mankind the ability to revolutionize most aspects of our common life. Properly applied, these advances can be used to improve the human condition throughout the world, an objective to which I would believe that we all aspire. Ironically, however, the very innovations that are making possible dramatic improvements in human well-being are also creating new problems which raise the specter of an alarming and possibly catastrophic disaster to the biosphere we live in. And herein lies the dilemma that we all face. Let me illustrate. Improved public health has caused the world's infant mortality rate to decline by 60% over the last 40 years. In the same period, the world's average life expectancy has increased from 46 years in 1950s to 63 years today. This is a development which, as individuals, we can only applaud. However, the result of these positive measures is a world population that has risen during the same short period of time geometrically to almost 6 billion people and could easily exceed 8 billion by the year 2020. The negative impact of population growth on all of our planetary ecosystems is becoming appallingly evident.
And when he says this, is he implying that there are too many eaters in the world and that billions must die to bring the population under control by financing both sides of wars, by using HAARP to cause famine, and by spreading deadly diseases such as HIV, Ebola, and others?
In particular, the rapid growing exploitation of the world's supply of energy and water is a matter of deep concern, and the toxic byproducts of widespread industrialization have increased atmospheric pollution to dangerous levels. Unless nations will agree to work together to tackle these cross-border challenges posed by population growth, overconsumption of resources, and environmental degradation, the prospects for a decent life on our planet will be threatened. The recent UN meeting in Cairo is appropriately focused on one of these key issues, population growth. But the controversies which have erupted at the conference illustrate the problem of coming to grips with issues that are deeply divisive and which have a profound moral dimension. The United Nations can and should play an essential role in helping the world find a satisfactory way of stabilizing world population and stimulating economic development in a manner that is sensitive to religious and moral considerations. Economic growth is, of course, an inevitable corollary of a growing population and is essential to improved standards of living. But without careful coordination, unrestrained economic growth poses further threats to our environment. This was a major subject of discussion at the conference in Rio de Janeiro on the environment 2 years ago. The focus then was on sustainable growth and global development. It was pointed out at the conference that growth is most efficiently managed by the private sector, but regulation of the process by national governments and international bodies is also needed. And once again, the United Nations should certainly be among the catalysts and coordinators of this process. But in addition, given the importance of unencumbered international trade in stimulating and facilitating economic growth, some of the newer economic entities, such as the European Economic Community, NAFTA, APEC, and most importantly GATT, now known as the World Trade Organization, are probably best suited to play a major role in ensuring sustainable development. A common requirement for dealing with all of these challenges, technological, environmental, political, and economic, is leadership. Leadership coupled with mutual trust and understanding. There is no magic formula for finding and producing leadership. We've seen many fine examples of it in very small nations as well as among the great powers. I believe that most of the world is anxiously searching for strong and effective leadership, even a great moral vision for the future. And it looks to the United States to play that role. In my opinion, we have no choice but to become more intimately involved in the resolution of the complex problems that I have outlined. And it is clearly in our national interest for us to do so. I recognize that calling for expanded international involvement is not a particularly popular proposition in the United States today, at a moment when domestic concerns and isolationist leanings have a tendency to dominate the debate. But as we have seen in recent months in Bosnia and Rwanda, in North Korea and Somalia, in Haiti and Cuba, the fabric of social life can be torn very easily, and the effects inevitably spill across borders with harmful consequences to us all. I do not believe that the United States can afford to look the other way. Although we no longer teeter on the edge of nuclear abyss, the world is still a very dangerous place. And I fear that without stronger and more focused American leadership, it will become even more dangerous. A U.S. foreign policy that is marked by drift and ad hocery, having little clarity or vision, leaves our nation and the world vulnerable to geopolitical disaster. What is needed is a foreign policy that follows a coherent, strategically defined direction based on an understanding of history and national interest, but also well attuned to the needs of other nations. The world's complex problems cannot be taken up neatly in an orderly sequence. Instead, we must be prepared to deal with issues systematically and often simultaneously as they arise. This will require a well-coordinated foreign policy establishment and a decision-making structure that is given comparable importance with domestic policy components of our national government. I do not for a moment wish to suggest that world leadership on the part of the United States should imply world domination. Clearly it does not and should not. Nor does it mean the U.S. must alone assume the mantle of leadership or become the world's policeman. But like it or not, we live in a global society. We must understand it. We must comprehend the forces that are affecting it. And we must act forcefully to protect our own interests as well as to promote the continued progress of all the world's peoples. In accepting the Business Council's medal last year, President Bush said, "Real peace is not an accident, it's an art form, the result of planning and patience and sometimes personal diplomacy." In his personal message to the program for tonight's event, Secretary General Boutros Boutros-Ghali noted that the reaffirmation and strengthening of democratic principles is of particular importance at this time. I agree, of course, with both of these propositions. I would only add that ultimately the strength and security of our nation derives from the purposefulness, self-discipline, and character of our own people. At this pivotal moment in our history, we cannot afford to hide our heads in the sand. We must make sure that 200 years of scientific progress, economic growth, and democratic rule are allowed to serve as the basis for our positive and constructive leadership in the family of nations in the 21st century. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you again from the bottom of my heart for the honor that you have bestowed on me this evening. Thank you very much.
Now, David really means the global union when he makes a statement.
Good morning, and thank you all very much for coming here to the department on this early Monday rainy morning. I'm very pleased to have a chance to meet with you on the very eve or moment of my departure for Mexico. I'm particularly honored to be back in the distinguished company of your founder, David Rockefeller, as well as John Avery and Ted Briggs. Ted was good enough to mention many who are here, and I especially welcome those who he mentioned, and I am very pleased that my colleague Mac McClarty, the President's counselor, is here. He'll be joining me on the trip to Mexico, but he'll be speaking with you before we both leave. I'm very pleased that Ted mentioned Acting Assistant Secretary Jeff Davidow as former ambassador to Venezuela and person with very wide experience in Latin America. I'm very pleased to have you know that he's going to be taking over in that key role and will be advancing our interests in Latin America and the Caribbean. This council and its members have played an invaluable role in supporting the triumph of open market democracies in our hemisphere. Through your commitment to dialogue, you have helped foster a deeper understanding among the leaders throughout the Americas, and as a channel between the United States government and the business community, you've helped to ensure that our policies meet the real needs of our companies and our workers. Since the day he took office, President Clinton has placed job creation and open and fair trade at the very center of our economic strategy. As you all know so well, he fought to ratify NAFTA and to complete the GATT-Uruguay round. He unified the leaders of the Asia-Pacific region to form there a commitment to open trade, and quite recently he and the leaders of the European Union have committed to build a new transatlantic marketplace with more open markets and more job creation. At the Miami summit, coming down to what interests us most, he helped to shape the consensus to negotiate a free trade area of the Americas that will encompass a $12 trillion market of 850 million consumers. His aim is to make this hemisphere an even more dynamic hub of the global economy, to open markets, to create jobs, and to lift living standards throughout this vital region. We remain on track to achieve by 2005 a free trade area of the Americas, which has begun to be called for shorthand purposes an FTAA. At the trade ministerials in Denver and Cartagena, we laid the foundations for negotiations, and we established working groups covering everything from free market access to intellectual property. We'll consider the recommendations of these working groups at the third trade ministerial next year in Brazil, where we will discuss at that time how to open the formal negotiations for an FTAA. In our effort to create an FTAA by 2005, I cannot stress enough the importance of your advice and support through your business forum and through other mechanisms. As I told business leaders a few weeks ago in Sao Paulo, you must remain involved and be intensively.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Again, we appreciate your being here with us. I would like to ask David Rockefeller to join us now, who is going to introduce our next speaker.
Thank you, John. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a very special pleasure for me to be able to introduce our next speaker. Mac, as he's known both inside the Beltway and more broadly across the United States, is of course a lifelong friend of President Clinton and currently serves as counselor to the President. Prior to assuming his present role, he served ably for 2 years as the President's Chief of Staff. But before coming to Washington, Mac was chairman of the board and chief executive officer of Arkla, Inc., a Fortune 500 company that is one of this country's largest natural gas companies. Perhaps because of that background in the private sector, he has been able to be such an extraordinarily effective voice in the current administration for the private sector and for this hemisphere. And I think that the members of the Council of the Americas and business leaders throughout the hemisphere owe him a real debt of gratitude for being the eloquent advocate that he has been for the private sector and a reliable collaborator in the effort to advance the process of hemispheric economic integration. As many of you here know, Mac was a tireless supporter of the North American Free Trade Agreement and took principal responsibility for organizing the very successful Summit of the Americas in 1994. In my opinion, the summit's clear focus on trade issues and economic integration owed a great deal to the persistence within the councils of the Clinton administration of Mac McLarty. But just on a more personal note, I would have to say that the large number of conversations that Mac and I have had over the past several years.
Now, why is a retired banker having a large number of conversations with President Clinton's chief of staff and counselor, Mac McLarty? Was he really meeting with Clinton and McLarty were just included in the meeting? And has Rockefeller had a large number of conversations with every U.S. president since about 1965? And when he has these conversations with these presidents, does he come to the White House? Are they required to go to New York City? Do they meet at Camp David, or perhaps at the Rockefeller Ranch out at Jackson Hole? They do get together, we just don't know where it happens.
It leads me to feel that of all the people who have been involved in this administration, he, perhaps more than any other, has understood the importance not only of the private sector, but of the role of the private sector in bringing about a different approach to Latin America, both on the economic and political front. And his quiet but very effective support with the President and with others in the administration has really made that difference. So his presence here today, I think, is of great importance to us, and also gives us an opportunity to express to him our special appreciation for that all-important role that he has played. And so, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Mac McLarty.
This is precisely the way one would like to start one's week, with a particularly warm and a particularly generous introduction. David, thank you very much. I'm afraid in my 4th year in Washington, the infamous Washington allergies have finally caught up with me, so I apologize this morning for my hoarseness, but I am delighted to be here, and I am very pleased to accept your invitation along with my colleagues, Ambassador Davidow and Patterson, Ambassador Babbitt, Ambassador Rich Brown, and other colleagues here at the State Department and the White House. I must say one of the real privileges in serving as the President's and the Secretary of State's Special Envoy to the Hemisphere is the close association that I've had the opportunity to develop with the Americas Society founder, David Rockefeller. I have had the opportunity to know the Rockefeller family for some time. As many of you know, Winthrop Rockefeller was governor in Arkansas, a 2-term governor in the 1960s, and his family maintains a valued legacy across our state and indeed in our national history. In speaking of David, and particularly after that generous introduction, I am reminded of the story of the Baron de Rothschild, who one day was approached in his office above the London Stock Exchange by an acquaintance requesting a small loan. Now, the Baron refused the loan, offering instead a gift that he claimed would far exceed the value of the requested sum. Heading down to the trading floor, the Baron put his arm around his acquaintance, and the two men walked slowly around the room as they conversed in a relaxed manner of trusted and old friends. Within hours, according to legend, the friend was able to raise the necessary funds elsewhere. So in a sense this morning, I feel as the Baron's friend must have felt. Now, I have never asked David Rockefeller for a loan, but he has been a valued mentor to me, and I know to so many of you, and I certainly count myself very fortunate to call him my friend. I've also known Ambassador Ted Briggs since before the Summit of the Americas. At this time last year, there was shrill voices on the left and on the right, criticizing almost in a cynical way our collective efforts of hemispheric integration. Some claimed the Summit of the Americas in Miami was little more than a glorified photo opportunity. Some questioned our real commitment to the implementation of the summit agenda and plan of action. And some called us wrong-headed or at least naive in thinking that we could fundamentally change and reorient hemispheric relations based on truly shared values and common interest. Well, as the old song goes, what a difference a year makes. And as the proverbial saying suggests, sometimes things do look like a failure in the middle. And our efforts to reinvent, fundamentally change hemispheric relationships have certainly had their moments of problems and concerns and frustrations. But I think it is fair to say that the summit has cemented a new consensus based on democracy and open markets. And as David noted, we have placed emphasis on the trade front, an emphasis on economically integrating the hemisphere. At both the Denver Trade Ministerial last June and the Cartagena Ministerial in March, we took concrete steps to achieve the free trade area of the Americas by the year 2005. Working groups were initially established in Denver. They've been expanded, and they will be gathering the critical information and laying the groundwork for the beginning of negotiations. Areas are being identified where early actions, an early harvest, if you will, can be put into place to benefit hemispheric business now, in the near term. And at the next Trade Ministerial, scheduled for Belo Horizonte, Brazil, early next year, we will be in a position to determine when and on what basis to proceed with actual negotiations. Now, let me say, not achieving Chile fast track this year was a disappointment. And in this political climate, with a limited time left legislatively, we will not be able to go forward this year. But even without that fast-track legislation, we want to move forward, and we will move forward to strengthen the NAFTA as the cornerstone on which we are building new hemispheric trade and investment infrastructure. The President is committed, as Secretary Christopher underscored in his comments, to free and open and fair trade. We remain committed to Chile's accession to NAFTA and strengthening the NAFTA as we move forward, and I look forward to those efforts in 1997. And let me say very clearly that we are not focused, as some have suggested, on establishing a new world order, but rather bringing order to a new world. But beyond
for this team is not whether they are politically agile and whether they're smart and whether whether they're savvy. All of those things they are. I think the big question is whether they have the capacity to construct a conceptual framework for American policy for the years ahead. We have lacked such a framework over the last few years since the Berlin Wall collapsed. The consensus we had, the understanding we had about what our purpose and what our role in the world should be, what the underlying tenets of American foreign policy obviously have disappeared, and no one yet has been able to come up with a coherent framework. George Bush tried. You remember just after the war during the conflict with Saddam Hussein, which he handled so superbly in a short-term sense, but he kept talking about a new world order. And then President Bush, at the end of that war, promised he would give 4 graduation addresses, 4 commencement addresses, describing that new world order and what America's role was going to be in it. Turned out he gave one of those addresses and canceled the other 3 and talked about something else. That's because they weren't ready yet to define that new framework. And we've had that same absence of a framework during the Clinton administration. It is, I think, the biggest challenge facing us, because it not only can give us a sense of where we are going, but it also can help in bringing the American people more fully into the support of what we're trying to do, because people now don't quite understand it. It seems very ad hoc to them.
U.S. leadership from administrations of both parties, we have in our era an unprecedented opportunity to integrate the world around basic principles of democracy, open markets, and a common commitment to peace. Not every country is yet able to participate fully in this integration. Some are in transition from centralized planning and totalitarian rule to democracy. Some have only begun to dip their toes into economic and political reform. Some are still too weak to participate meaningfully in the international system. And a few, such as Iraq, Iran, and Castro's Cuba, have governments that actively oppose the premises upon which that system is based. As a policymaker, I see a corresponding 4-part challenge. First, to strengthen the ties and prevent ruptures among full participants in the international system. Second, to help transitional states to play a greater role. Third, to give a boost to the weak states most willing to do what is necessary to join the system. And fourth, to make it clear to the outlaw states that they cannot prosper at the expense of the rest. They must either reform or suffer in isolation. Clearly, the international system is not a precise term. It refers to a vast network of rules that govern ties among countries, rules that range from the simplest bilateral treaty to the most complex global agreement. Because it serves our interests, it is U.S. policy to help the system remain vibrant and become more inclusive. That is why we're working with our allies to build a NATO strengthened by new members and trained for new missions. It is why we have worked with friends in Asia to freeze North Korea's nuclear program. It is why we stand with the peacemakers against the bomb throwers in the Middle East, Northern Ireland, Bosnia, and other troubled regions. And it is why we're determined to build on the 1994 Summit of the Americas to further integrate our own hemisphere as a bastion of democracy, a hub of economic growth, and a leader in promoting security through law. Progress within our region is not a zero-sum game. As nations, corporations, and people, we all have a stake in whether we can establish and enforce a system of standards that will cause our hemispheric community to grow more peaceful, prosperous, stable, and free. That is the philosophical underpinning of NAFTA and our goal of a free trade agreement for the Americas by the year 2005.
But especially want to express my appreciation being here today with David Rockefeller. I've known David for many years, and as the founding member of the council, he's rendered yeoman duty to the nation. The family has a long history of strengthening the bonds of friendship throughout the Western Hemisphere, and of course my predecessor, Nelson Rockefeller, served as Assistant Secretary of State for Latin America in this department back in the 1940s. In organizing the council in 1965, David and his colleagues were among the first to grasp the enormous consequences and possibilities for the economic and political progress throughout the Americas. In the 37 years since then, many of those possibilities have been realized. In 1965, Latin America had very few free market economies and only a handful of democracies. To pursue a free trade agreement with the nations of Central America. Success here will further strengthen our economic ties with those countries and reinforce the economic and political progress they've made over the last decade. Free trade with Central America will also move us toward an even broader aim, a free trade area of the Americas, up and running by January of 2005. The President is strongly committed to this goal, and all of our trade efforts are pointed in this direction. The Council of the Americas has been crucial in bringing us to this moment, and I know that we can count on your wisdom and your commitment in completing the great work that lies ahead. Thank you very much.
Mr. Vice President, on behalf of all of us here, I'd like to express a word of thanks to you. In a time of trepidation and confusion, you have responded with confidence and clarity. The administration's leadership has inspired us all. Your own calm has been our comfort. Your conviction, our compass, and your resolve, our strength. When we are able to go about our business here in the Americas and around the world with confidence and security, it's because we know the strength of this government stands behind us. For that and for all your other contributions, we thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking the Vice Presidents of the United States for being here. Thank you for joining us here today. Thank you.
Just as a side note, just talk about the wealthiest people in the United States and particularly in the world. Forbes magazine every year produces a list of what they call the wealthiest people or families in the world. And in recent years, Bill Gates has been touted to be the most wealthy and with a net worth of somewhere $40 or $50 billion. Depending on the value of his stock on the stock exchange. But he's a pauper when compared to the Rothschilds and the Rockefellers. And let's look at the wealthiest families in the world. each year Forbes magazine ranks the wealthiest people in the world, or so they say, but none of their list include the Rockefellers and Rothschilds. In 1998, the Rockefeller family was worth $11.48 trillion, and the Rothschild family is worth somewhere between $100 and $400 trillion, possibly more. And they get this tremendous wealth because they own the central banks of all the nations in the world, except the rogue nations. And when they need money, they simply just print it. It's not backed by gold or silver or anything of value. The U.S. State Department has called several nations rogue nations. And their definition of a rogue nation is any nation that harbors or finances terrorists. Now, if we look at the current nations on this list, one is Cuba, and there's absolutely no evidence that Cuba harbors or finances terrorists, so they could not meet that definition. Another rogue nation, as defined by the State Department, is North Korea. They do sell weapons to anyone in the world that'll buy them, but there's no evidence that North Korea harbors or finances terrorists. A couple of other rogue nations, as defined by the State Department, are Afghanistan. By the way, the elite established a central bank in Afghanistan in the year 2002, one of their objectives. Another rogue nation is Iraq. We've invaded Iraq, and they've already established a central bank in Iraq, and they did it in the year 2003, toward the mid-year. The remaining rogue nations, as defined by the State Department, are Syria, Iran, Sudan, Libya, and Pakistan. And President Bush has made several conversations about possibly the need to look into Syria and Iran next, and if they do, then it won't be long till Sudan, Libya, and Pakistan will follow. Now, rather than harboring or financing terrorists, the only common thread between all these rogue nations is that none of these nations allowed the international bankers to own their central bank. That's the real reason that they're called rogue nations. Now, who's behind all of this? Some call them the Illuminati, others call them the shadow government. When George Herbert Walker Bush was president, he called them the New World Order. Others call them the International Banking Cabal. I simply call them the Global Union. Now, what will happen in the United States between now and the year 2006? Let's get into that. In order to complete the American Union, the elite must create either a economic or civil crisis, and it's my contention that they won't do this in the year 2004 because it's a major presidential election year, and they want to re-elect George Bush, so they will wait until the year 2005 to crash the economy of the United States. So somewhere in early part of 2005 or no later than 2006, we will have a very heavy recession and possibly a major depression. In order to create a civil uprising, they will cause the people that joined the militias back before Y2K to come out of the woodwork, because no dictator has ever taken over their country or their region without first declaring private ownership of firearms illegal. So there will be continuing steps to tighten up on the control of firearms within the United States, and then sometime in the year 2005 they will outlaw them completely. And this is a deliberate plan to bring the militias out, have them create a civil uprising so that they can have justification for martial law. They have already created concentration camps on most, if not all, of the military bases in the United States, and the purpose is not to harbor or to house terrorists as they're arrested. It's to house the militia that are arrested when they create the civil uprising and protest of the outlawing of private ownership of weapons. And they've already enacted what they call enemy combatants, and when they label a person an enemy combatant, even though they may be a citizen of the United States, they will be denied all their civil rights under the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. They will not be tried in civil courts, but tried in military tribunals. So after we've had this major economic crisis and major civil uprising within the United States, the President of the United States will then be justified under the law to declare martial law, which voids the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and is a prelude to the creation of the American Union. Now let's talk about the real reasons why the United States military forces have been involved in the last 3 wars. The war in Kosovo happened because they needed to send troops in there to take over control of that area so that they could have a route for a pipeline from the Caspian Sea oil fields westward to a saltwater port. And that's the major reason that our troops went to Kosovo and are still there. Then the President sent our military force into Afghanistan. The troops had already been shipped into the area and were ready to go into Afghanistan even before 9/11 happened. But our troops are there to guarantee that the elite can establish their central bank, which they've already done in the year 2002. The CIA wanted to gain complete control of the poppy fields of Afghanistan because that region is responsible for 70% of the opium that's sold around the world. And the oil companies wanted to run a 48-inch gas pipeline from the Caspian Sea oil fields through Afghanistan, Pakistan, south to a saltwater port. They also wanted a route through Afghanistan to run both gas and oil pipelines into China, because China is in desperate need of energy sources. Then we had our troops sent to Iraq for very similar reasons, to establish a central bank in Iraq, and that was done around mid-year of 2003. They needed to gain control of the oil fields of Iraq. Many people have been saying for years that Iraq had the world's second largest supply of oil. There are now speculation that they could possibly have more oil reserves than Saudi Arabia. Now, Iraq has never been a threat to the United States, but they have been a direct threat to Israel, and so our troops are sent there to protect Israel, not the United States. Then they also wanted to get the U.S. citizens' minds off of the near depression that we're in now and will later turn into a possible depression. And they want to get the citizens' minds off of the creation of the free trade area of the Americas, which will then become the American Union. I hope that I have alerted you and maybe alarmed you with the knowledge of what is coming. And I don't think that the danger will be in 2004 because this is presidential year. But I suspect that in the year 2005 and certainly by 2006 they will have created the American Union, which after they finish the Pacific Union and possibly a Soviet Union, which will be a rejuvenation of the former communist nations. But this time these regions of the Soviet Union will not be under communist control but under the elite control. So let's get into things that you need to do to prepare for these events that are coming certainly in the year 2005. I don't think it'll be sooner and not a whole lot later than 2005, but you need to get ready because they're on the way. We're certainly living in troubled times. Now, what should we do about it? Many people in the United States went through a lot of preparation for the Y2K, which turned out to not be a major crisis, probably because everyone was too prepared for it. But what you did in Y2K is just a blip on what you should do to prepare for the American Union crisis. So I would advise everyone to do everything that you were advised to do in preparation for Y2K, but instead of planning for just a couple of weeks of emergency supplies and actions, you might be better preparing for at least 1 to 2 years of very hard times. So this is going to be at least 10 times the threat that Y2K was in terms of your daily quality of life. You should get your personal finances as clean as you possibly can. I know everyone can't do that, but you should certainly minimize your risk, and you need to minimize your debt, pay off as many loans you can, credit cards and so forth, because the banks will probably be foreclosing on the assets of a lot of people due to economic hardship. And certainly avoid stocks, bonds, and commodities. These markets are controlled by the elite. So whatever cash you have or finances you have on hand are available to you. Keep them in a cash-like basis, either in a CD, in a savings account of some sort, in a bank, but never have more than $100,000 in any one bank. And because if the federal government insures bank assets up to $100,000 per person, but be very, very careful about your cash in the next 3 years at least. And besides protecting your financial assets, you need to protest to all your elected officials loud, clear, and as long as you could stand it. Because the only way they're going to do anything about it is if they hear enough flack from the citizenry, and they just will say, well, the public doesn't care because nobody's really raised any stink about it. So you need to start raising some stink. Now, don't be allowed to be sucked into any forms of violence in response to this creation of the American Union. If we ever have to resort to violence, let's use that as a very last ditch stand when it's either slavery or our freedom. And because the elite control the military, most law enforcement, and they certainly control Congress and all forms of state and federal government, and you don't stand a chance if you try to resort to violence. So Martin Luther King and Mahatma Gandhi had the answer, and that's through peaceful demonstrations. That's the only way to ever get what you want in life. Thank you for your patience and going through this video. Parts of it are not too entertaining, but very, very informative. This is probably the most important message that you'll receive possibly in your lifetime, because it will directly affect your physical well-being, your financial well-being, and your quality of life. And the advantage of having knowledge is so that you can prepare for it. And so I wish you and your family the very best, and may God bless you. Thank you.